Hey everybody. Just want to make sure this is going okay. It's working. Welcome back. Um okay, so we have our probably our last major new thing to last really new thing to introduce actually for the semester, if you can believe that. Actually, we're really winding down here. And that will be feature writing. So just kind of like as a postmortem of the I'm sorry, the Megalomania assignment. Overall, overall, the class did very well. I know this is like your first big test. It really like kind of more in-depth reporting and that sort of thing. But there were a few people who did not, do what needed to be done. And I mean, if you just maybe had just emailed Bill Borden and right from the get-go, you would have probably gotten a response. I mean, he wasn't extended the deadline and everything else. So, you know, and he also has his own life, so so I mean the people who didn't do well on this, and there were a few D's, you know, sorry,
Big time
excuse me for this.
pension funds, big time.
People who didn't do well on this. I mean, it was clearly that was what was going on, and even like maybe like a simple like thing, an email to me saying, "Is this what the story should be themed as? Is this that?" I mean, I saw stories that were just kind of not in anywhere near in a ballpark. So, it's an online class. We took it for a reason. That's great, but we have to do the work too. I mean, we have to keep up with the videos and everything else. So, but overall, the class did very well. I'd say there was probably three-quarters of the class that got A's. Um, so let's please now we have 2 weeks on this new assignment, which will be a feature assignment. Feature assignment. What is that exactly? So what we've been doing essentially is essentially a hard-hitting news. What we did before with data journalism assignment, that's a hard-hitting news assignment. Some were a little softer than others, as they say, like the crime reaction story, but they generally had like essentially like one sentence leads where that's something maybe you could tweet out or put on Facebook or something like that as breaking news or something. Sort of an alarm bell for the whatever particular area you're covering or whatever. Um, but feature stories are the stories that actually where you can actually flex your creative muscles a little bit more. Okay. And by that I mean like instead of just being accurate, clear, and focused, you can be like more descriptive. You can be more colorful, but it still means that analysis and opinion have no place. And I have to say that was actually one of the big stumbling blocks in the megalomania stories. Some people still are not really listening to me when I say that news stories do not have opinion or analysis, self-opinion or analysis. If there is opinion analysis in there, I mean, they do have opinion analysis in there, but they're attributed to a source. Okay, like whatever source is providing information or whatever, whether it's a document, a person, or whatever. So you really have to keep that in mind. That it's even if you have to attribute in every single graph to a source, he said, she said, they said, that's fine as long as it's not comes across your opinion. There's no conclusions. I still have people who are writing conclusions, so let's please not do that. Okay. All right. So the book actually also has two chapters, 8 and 12, that deal with feature writing. But I like to like point people first. And actually, I just also a reminder, I also put up, data journalism assignments have to be done by end of day Monday, and that the rewrite is due on a week from Monday, should be April 1st. And also thank you for getting the major assignment proposals in. There were a couple people, 3 or 4 people who did not. That means you'll be getting a single grade lower um on the final assignment. Okay, so it was something you were supposed to do. So, all right. But anyway, so those two things are due, and I'll be mentioning. Again, there are actually posts for each of those. Okay, the data journalism rewrite. Okay, again, please stick to what's um in the template that I have. All right. Sorry, right here. Just get this away. Something I want to show you guys later. The real megalomania Mark Bronson. come to life. So what we have here essentially is, again, this is actually something I'm going to be posting on Monday when actually I post my video, this video right here. You have the data journalism assignment rewrite due April 1st, and then of course the feature assignment due April 8th. And of course the major assignment proposal, which was due this past Thursday, okay? All right. So what I like to do is I like to point people to the modules actually. And again, we have chapters 8 and 12 that talk about feature writing, but I try to like really present it myself because I feel like prior textbooks did a better job. To be honest with you, I've been teaching here for 20 years. Did a better job actually really talking about what feature stories are. Okay. And the really like the big difference between a feature story and what we've been doing, the traditional daily news story, hard hitting story, is really in the lead. So we kind of go off script here. I've been telling you guys one sentence leads, one sentence leads, one sentence leads. Well, these do not have one sentence leads. In fact, please do not send me a one sentence lead. Okay. All right. So this week, prepare to do feature news writing. Okay. This class we'll be doing a feature news segment that will require you to think on your feet. Again, this is like one of the last weeks on the modules. If you check, provides a guide of what we're doing each week. Okay. And I also provided essentially I meant to actually provide a discussion point for this. So let me make sure that I do that. But I provided a video to show how you could take essentially information from a discussion point. And but by the way, don't forget this too. There's also a discussion point on a tuition because I only see 3 people talking here. So but anyway, let's see, here we go, right here. This will be posted on Monday, and this will help provide information for your story on the feature assignment. Again, you want to you don't have to use information from people for this assignment, but I am looking for people to participate in this. Please give your opinions here, but also provide an anecdote or two, such as talking about a particular moment or day, or choosing clothes where it's hard, or you were having trouble driving in the bad weather. And that's actually what our assignment's going to be. It's going to be a reaction to the weather. That's happens. I didn't realize a bunch of you are actually not in New Jersey. So reaction to the weather that's going on right now, wherever you are. Okay. So this is going to be posted. I have this in November, right? Okay. So actually, I'm going to post this actually right now. It is March. And I'll just make it. That's interesting. Okay, so it's actually, I'll just do it then. And then okay, so then we have there last day when the when the rewrite will be due on the 8th, a week after that. Okay. Okay, so I'll post this now. All right, so you have a discussion point, please participate in that. And that's actually, again, that's actually a that's actually, again, something I'm going to be looking at in terms of people, I want people to participate in that, and that's class participation. So all right, we'll pin that too. There we go. But please don't forget to participate in this one too, the tuition hikes. Okay. All right. And please try to contribute as soon as possible, really before the I don't really set deadlines on this, but I mean, please try to do this at least before the actually I'm sorry that I actually made it for the actual. I usually make sure to think the deadline. I'm all over the place, and I apologize for that. I make it actually the rewrite will be due on the 15th. The actual first story is due on the 8th. Sorry about that. So I'll make it the deadline for the 8th, which is the first draft on the feature assignment, which I said before is going to be a reaction to the weather. Okay. All right. So before I talked about how like one of the big differences between a feature assignment and a traditional news daily news story. It's actually, they also call these Sunday news stories, these featured news stories, because the Sunday paper a long time ago used to be the most widely read paper of the week. And because of that, everybody advertising that week. So the paper, it actually still is to this day, is actually like fatter than it usually is. So they actually like created more space, and before the internet, that was a big deal because now you have unlimited space. But basically, the idea is that you try to fill up the paper as much as possible. And that was a day you would like write longer stories. Also, it was a day that people didn't work, so they would actually write these stories ahead of time, and typically they'd be what they call evergreen stories. That maybe you take like a breaking news story and you'd follow it up. Like I've talked before about sidebars and that sort of thing. You take like maybe a particular angle of maybe like a train accident or something, one person's survival story, and you break it off into this feature story that's colorful, more descriptive, more emotional, that sort of thing. Okay. Um, so anyway, going back to the module. All right, so the feature story. And like I said, it's right down here under week, under the it says April 8th. I'm actually kind of a little bit ahead of the curve here. Feature news, okay. All right. So it's a little bit ahead of the curve. And like I said, I have a video here describing like how to take essentially the information that's provided in the discussion points and turn it into a feature story. All right, so let me just like simply explain to you like how they're done, okay? Um, and let's see here. Where are we here? All right, so we're used to this basically this story where we have a lead, okay? Where it's just essentially like one sentence lead, okay? And then maybe you have like a transition. Maybe you have another transition because maybe it's a breaking news story or something like that. It's just point by point by point. Maybe you have an anecdote like we have like in this current story at the bottom of the current story, the data journalism story. And maybe a quote, that sort of thing. The big difference is right here, actually. To be honest with you, if you get this lead right, I probably won't care as much about the rest of the story. Yeah, I mean, I'll care about whether it's written well and that sort of thing. But as far as being the descriptive end of it is important, but it's the real part of it is the lead. The lead is supposed to be written in a way that's supposed to hook you in. Unlike the other stories that we've written where we kind of like take into account that people typically read the first or second paragraph and then they're done. Okay, so that's what makes the first, second lead important. This story is actually this type of story. They want you, it's written to be read. It's written to be read from top to bottom. And then the lead essentially is what they call an anecdotal lead, okay, or a narrative lead, okay. All right, and what that means is that the lead is actually essentially broken into different parts, okay, and it's actually typically several sentences or even several paragraphs long, okay. And what you do is you begin with teases, the tease, where actually the first paragraph doesn't tell you what everything you need to know. In fact, there's like a certain air of mystery to what is presented in this new story at the top. There's actually cliffhangers and stuff like that. Yes, it's true. Goes against the total opposite grain of what we've been doing before. We actually like cliffhangers this time. Okay, and then what you're doing is they're suspenseful. They kind of like takes the suspense steps of suspense. They're surprising, that sort of thing. And what they do is there's a paragraph here that kind of teases you into the story, another paragraph here that teases you into the story, maybe even another paragraph that teases you into the story. But then what happens is it comes around to what essentially is also called a delayed lead or nut graph. Okay. And what that does is it actually sums up what the story is as a whole. Okay. Much like your traditional lead would do. Okay. Um, you have a nut graph essentially like just takes like again what the traditionally would do and just sum everything up. But before you get to that point, you have a couple like two or three paragraphs that kind of build suspense into the story. They take a more of a colorful approach to the story, okay? And that's where description becomes important, that sort of thing. And description, by the way, has to be factual description. No adjectives that are like opinionated, like glorious or incredible. Or I saw people write in megalomania assignments like humongous company, well, okay, maybe that was okay, but maybe like something like the most powerful company in the world. I mean, that's like what they call hyperbole. Okay. I mean, you kind of bought the company spin there. Okay. Um, big company. Yeah, that's true. Most important company. No, that's an opinion. Okay. All right. So your lead essentially is like this. Sorry. It's usually like this whole part right here is your lead. Okay. And your T's might be something along the lines of like John Smith um lost his dog. Um he thought he'd never see him again. I have my dog next to me, by the way. Hi, Richard, say hi. Leaving you in suspense, like what's gonna happen to the dog? You actually leaves you asking questions because it wants to kind of hook you into this emotional kind of like gut-wrenching way that kind of like brings you from step to step, paragraph to paragraph. He put posters up all over town. So many dogs looked like his, he said. He never came until July 4th. And maybe even have a quote that comes in here or something like that. Like, um, he came running down the street and jumped on me. See, suspenseful, like almost works like a chronological order sort of way, one step at a time. Each thing is kind of a cliffhanger, leaving you vague. Again, I know this is long, but the idea is that you do want people to read the whole story. You want more than just people saying, I'm gonna read the first paragraph or two and dive out. You want them to read from top to bottom. Advertisers love these stories, by the way. Because when people read the whole story as opposed to just a couple paragraphs, like their advertisement on the web that might be like on the bottom of the story or on the side will be seen, because people will actually read the whole story. Okay. Smith said. And then the nut graph, what that does, it actually almost acts as like a landing pad. Okay, like a helicopter landing pad or something like that, where everything kind of comes together in like what a typical lead would do, and say something like Smith is among many dog owners who have lost their beloved, that's a fine adjective, pets this year. Some are not as lucky as maybe it's a story about a service in town that provides this kind of like service where they actually like find dogs. But he did rely on a successful service for help. And I'll just make up something here. Dogs are us. It's just okay. So it's a story about dogs are us and the sort of things they do, right? And maybe they help find the dogs. But instead of just coming out and saying that, Dogs R Us is a company that basically helps people find dogs. We actually build some suspenseful, tear-jerking way getting into that nut graph and into the story, the main story idea. Okay. And then actually what happens is then what you do is you go back maybe into like your what we did with the crime reaction story. You follow that pattern, okay, where you go into transition and then maybe another anecdote and then a quote, okay. Um, dogs are us. Maybe the first transition is uses gentle techniques. God, techniques. They say in finding dogs, and then like you have an anecdote where you have describes one of those anecdote those gentle techniques. Why do they call this an anecdotal lead, by the way? Because this in itself is an anecdote right here. What you're basically doing is you're taking like what would be like an anecdote maybe in the middle of the story right here under one of these transitions, and you're putting it at the top of the story. That's essentially what you're doing. That's the only real big change, really. You're taking that anecdote that's in the middle of the story, like we did with the crime reaction story, and putting it at the top. Okay. So that is a feature story. So then if like I said, then it follows kind of like the same old path. Dogs are us use general techniques they say in finding dogs. One of them was Fred Jones, who lost his dog in June. The company found the dog, and one of the things they do when they're, being gentle with dogs is they use window screens instead of like a net or something like that. Screens to bring the dog back. That sort of thing. They said. So that could be like an anecdote, and then like another quote. And then you go back to another transition: who, what, where, how, why, when, and that sort of thing. So you follow that same kind of order once you get through this anecdotal lead right here. Okay. All right. And then I provide examples right here, actually within the story itself. Sorry, within the module itself. It's also in the assignment entry, which will be posted. This is one of them I provided right here. This is actually a really good New York Times story. Oops. Right here. That basically followed that pattern. Okay. And what they typically do is, like I said, they typically take like maybe like breaking news stories, hard news stories, that sort of thing. And they're also called soft news. They provide like some sort of a softer edge to the news. Some sort of softer focus, something that's more featurey, colorful, that sort of thing. So I mean, there was like this period of time, like 10 years ago, when people were like worried about Somali pirates and what they were doing and that sort of thing. And they were all like robbing people in the Mediterranean Sea and that sort of thing. And this was interesting story about one individual pirate and like how he corresponded with like one of the people he was actually, I think it was actually kidnapped. Okay. So they took like a piece of like that larger story and found a piece of that story that's actually it could make its own story and have a softer focus. And like I said, again, it kind of leaves cliffhanging and that sort of thing, and suspense at the top of the story. Somali pirates kidnapped and held Michael Scott Moore, a journalist, hostage for 2.5 terrifying years until a ransom payment secure is released in 2014. Okay. Okay, so maybe that sounds like a little bit old. You're saying, okay, so what's the point of this? You're leaving no questions. 2 months later, Mr. Moore received a surprising message on Facebook, and it leaves you questions like, my God, like you think almost like the worst of it, like, like what are they doing? They're sending a threatening message. What's going on here? But no, here comes the surprise element. How are you, Michael? The message said, I'm your friend Mohammed Tahil. I want to speak with you. The sender's Facebook page included his photograph. Mr. Moore recognized him as one of the men who guarded him during his captivity in Somalia. He decided to write back. Wafal was so basically just point by point, tease by tease. Wafal was an extraordinary exchange of Facebook messages between a journalist and his former captor. How long they communicated and where the conversation ultimately led has not been made public, but in the summer, the Somali was taken into custody. So it's about this basically this conversation that led to somebody being arrested. That's what the story is about. Okay. Um, so yeah, and then I mean it goes maybe into a little background, but then basically kind of goes into essentially the Facebook message exchange and what happened there and that sort of thing, and more details of which, again, following that transition anecdote quote kind of pattern I've talked about. Okay. All right, so that's essentially like what a feature news story is. I used to do a web page for my classes, and we used to post. I know that it became kind of passe, but this is actually somebody writing about the bus system at Rutgers, but taking kind of a featurey approach to it. Rutgers sophomore Claire Garatu quickly looked at the University next bus, and in 5 minutes she immediately left her apartment. Again, leaving you hanging. Not supposed to tell you everything you need to know, giving you some sort of piece to like keep reading on and on because maybe there's suspense there. She quickly approached the bus stop, but she found the bus leaving. Frustrated, she cursed at the bus. Thanks to next bus, she waited at the bus stop for 10 minutes when she could have waited inside her own apartment. Next bus sucks, she said. I'm so tired of running for buses that end up leaving me. So yeah, and this is how it's usually kind of like comes to like fruition here in terms of like the nut graph. You basically have like have like you basically what you do is you it's really important, I would say, to really when you do these anecdotes at the top of the story to really just focus on one person. Okay. Please hear me now. Okay. Because I have a feeling a lot of people aren't really listening to what I'm saying. Focus on one person in this story, not a bunch of people. When I've had people focus on a bunch of people, what happens is it's too general and you can't get decent enough, specific enough details that are really like rich, details about what's going on. And when you focus on one single person, you can get richer, deeper details. If you say like a bunch of people were walking around like frustrated with next bus, then what do you're supposed to do? Write about a bunch of people? I mean, there's nothing really there to really write about. I mean, you can't get in all their heads. You can't like write about 10 people at once. So what happens is it comes out very thin, the information that's provided. There's no depth to that. When you focus on one person in this story at a time, you can actually get depth. Okay. And then what usually happens is when the nut graph comes around, Siguratu is just one of many students at Rutgers who feel that the Rutgers bus system can waste a lot of the students' time. Okay. So that becomes the nut graph, basically about students who feel like it wastes their time. So, and she's just one of them. Okay. And then essentially it follows that kind of pattern I talked about. Oh, somewhat. This one actually goes off a little bit. There's a nut graph right here. There's transitions. So many students say they want to travel from campus to another half hour to an hour can, must be taken out of their schedule. And then you have junior Carol has always had to deal with taking the bus during rush hour. Carol is to frantically rush out of class to get to the bus stop because there's always a crowd of students to get on the bus. Getting into that granular detail that we've talked about before, especially with the crime reaction story. Okay. All right. So yeah. So that is another example right there of how that works. All right. So what I did was in the module, I included passages from previous textbooks that I think actually better describe how these stories work. Okay. Um, and then the book actually does, but we will talk about what the book shows. The book has a section called alternative leads, which is essentially what this is, alternative lead. Okay. Differentiating feature stories from news stories is misleading. The two actually have a great deal in common. The difference is emphasis. The styles that are commonly used for feature stories assume that the reader has more time to read. Exactly. They still require a central theme, however. That's where your nut graph comes in. The writer must be able to summarize the point of the story, but the writing must require that the reader go further to fully understand the point of the story. And it includes the top of the story. You have to go a little bit deeper than you normally do. It's just not just one sentence. Okay. Feature writing is a way for both readers and writers to get away from the relevant facts only approach. Feature stories generally contain more detail and description. So in this kind of story, you might want to actually like have a sentence or two that go, or maybe when you instead of like saying John Brown rides the bus, you say like John Brown carefully got onto the bus as the rain poured on his head. You want to maybe add a few more words to maybe the stuff you would say to show atmosphere, scenery, that sort of thing. The where becomes a little more important in these types of stories because it shows like some sort of gives you some sort of sense of reality of being there. Okay. Um, you go beyond the news stories by trying to discover the interesting or important side of an event that may not be covered by the 6 basic news values. Okay, which we've talked about before: impact, conflict, that sort of thing. Okay. It's a more relaxed story, sure, style, sure, but it's also basically that it's still a substantive story. Okay. Um, I mean, you have to work probably just as hard or harder because you have to get some more details when you talk to somebody and interview somebody. Instead of saying to them like, okay, well, how was the bus ride? You have to say to them like maybe something on. You have to add to that. You have to say something like, okay, well, the bus ride was slow and that sort of thing, but what was he feeling? Well, I mean, what was his frustration level? Like, was he sweating? And again, that's where the environment comes in, the scenery. Was he sweating? Was he when he was walking on the bus? Was he being rained on? Was he wearing a coat? Especially when you deal with the weather, which is going to be our assignment, that's going to be like a big one. Like, were they wearing a coat, or what are they? We've had days where it's been like what 70 degrees recently, but now it went down back to like 30 or 40. So that's basically the changing weather that I've been talking about. Okay. Um. So the lead of the feature story is the most important part. Feature writers are not bound by one sentence, 30 lead paragraph structure. A lead in a feature story may be several sentences or paragraphs long, okay? Now what this did was it actually provided us some sort of a comparison that was similar to one I provided before, okay? And what you have here is like, here's your typical news story, okay? I'm sorry. Make sure I get to the right one. Okay. Yeah, actually it's this one, I'm sorry. Traditional news lead. Give the who, what, where, how, why of the story, frame the story. I mean, that's pretty much all you're doing there. And then it's essentially like the details, transitions, that sort of thing. What the feature story does, it does what they call it's an anecdotal lead, but it's a narrative lead. So what you're doing is you're actually like telling a story on top of the story. Telling like a little mini story that illuminates the larger story, but you're doing it at the top, okay? And then it's all kind of like winds together because eventually people want to know what the hell you're talking about in some sort of a nut graph. And then you proceed with the body, much like you would with the traditional news story, okay? This one like provides like probably some more extreme examples of like some of those articles that are actually like that are done. And I know this is actually a little boring, so I'm just gonna move on to this. The nut paragraph, foreshadowing and to be sure, like the lead in the inverted pyramid story, nut graph or nut graph. The nut is like the theme of the story. That's like another term for it. There's a paragraph that gives the theme of the story and summarizes the key facts. Unlike the leading inverted pyramid in the inverted pyramid format, however, the nut graph is not the first paragraph of the story. Okay. All right. So let's just move down a little bit. Here's a good one right here. And they don't have to be like tremendously long either. They carry knapsacks and bags to tote loot. They had a screwdriver to pry open doors. I mean, okay, so this isn't one person, but this particular story wasn't about one person anyway. They used latex gloves. I mean, they might have been better if they did actually have one person, but whatever. They acted like professional criminals, but officials say they were teenage burglars, coached and directed by a Palm Harbor woman whose son and daughter were part of the gang. So that's your story right there. It's a nut graph that sums everything up, but there's some vague kind of suspenseful materials first, and it actually makes you think like these are like criminals are going to come into your house, that sort of thing. Okay. I provide like essentially again different comparisons like there's the straight news lead after mass protests in Poland, legislators with the country's ruling party have abruptly reversed positions, blah blah blah. And then you have an anecdotal lead. Um, basically it actually looks at like the description and that sort of thing. It talks about, there's blood smeared floor and stuff like that. So yeah. Anyway. Again, that is in the module itself. Okay. All right. So what are you doing actually? Finally got to that, right? So actually, what's interesting about this, I'm sorry, yes, that's the data journalism rewrite. Okay. Anyway, and again, I have a teacher view up here. So feature assignment. Okay. Okay, so you're gonna write a 500, 800 word feature story, and instructions for which are here. Okay. And I'll show you what that is. I downloaded it before. Okay. Okay. So it's due April 8th. And I know, I thought it was actually better to actually, like, instead of just sticking this in the middle of an assignment entry, just actually having a separate Microsoft Word doc that shows you what I'm looking for here. Okay. So for this assignment, I know this may sound like not the most exciting topic in the world, but it's about the weather. Weather stories, as I said before, are actually probably the most popular stories out there. They're more popular than political scandals. It's true. I've seen it. Okay. And they affect people's routines. So you should be able to get lots of detail. Think about like the first thing you do every day, put on your clothes, right? Isn't kind of a pain in the ass sometimes when you don't know what the hell the weather is because you have to figure out, maybe you don't have it's cold outside, and your sweatshirts are dirty and you're like, oh shit, I got to go out, excuse me, and be out there today and I can't go out there with a sweatshirt with a stain on it, that sort of thing. These may seem like small details and that sort of thing, compared to people being sick. But at the same time, they're like, they become like the biggest issue in the first 10 minutes of your day. Okay. And that's significant enough. So this assignment, you'll write a 500 word story, flex your creative muscles, use an anecdotal lead with a nut graph. These leads describe action in narrative form. The narrative brings you to a nut graph, which ultimately answers this question: what is the story about? Make notes of what do you see? What are the people wearing? Is it cold outside? Okay, is it raining? Right now, I'm actually sitting out there. It's like a monsoon outside. It's Saturday. Here's the first paragraph right here. What would be like essentially the lead into like a weather story. On Monday, Walter Shrub wore sandals as he rode the bus. It was warm. On Tuesday, it was cold, but Shrub was still wearing sandals. See, again, not telling you everything you need to know. Kind of going, what's happening next? Gonna be swallowed by a monster? Why? I'm protesting the cold. No, he's just being defiant. I hope God sees us, or at least Mother Nature. And then a nut graph which explains what the story is about. Okay. All right. So here's your idea. Interview people about the weather and the changing of the seasons and how it's impacting them. And right, because that's we've had such up and that's way I realize maybe people live in areas where that doesn't necessarily happen, but those of you who live like in New Jersey and elsewhere, I mean, it is happening. It's basically you have the inconsistency of the weather. If it's like you're in an area where maybe it's warm all the time, then write about that. Okay, that's fine. But I take into account, like, I have to admit, like, what the weather is at Rutgers. You don't have to, okay? But the weather at Rutgers right now is like totally, completely up and down. So talk to, and that could cause a lot of frustration because people, and like I said, what's one of the first things that it impacts you is their clothing, okay? Describe the color of the leaves, the grass, the sky. I mean, that's you want to incorporate some sort of vision, some sort of description into the story, okay? So you talk to people about the weather and how they're adjusting to the ups and downs or whatever they are. Are they going outside? What are they doing? What do you think of the colder weather, about the commute, that sort of thing? And you got a lot of people who are commuting. You want to ask about that maybe too, anything that basically affects their daily routines. Okay. Please use an anecdotal lead as like we talked about just now. Okay. I focus on one person's. Remember, stick with one person on the anecdotal lead, not 10, not two, not three. Okay. Just one person at a time. Okay. Because that way you get more depth and details. Important note about this, I know this may seem a little weird, but I've had people like do this story before and they've turned their sources, their students or whatever other people they know, into scientists. This is not a global warming story, okay? I have had people, that's a big important point, and I've had people not listen to me on this, okay? This is not a story about people's opinions about global warming or climate change. And by the way, it's if you want to ask me, as far as I'm concerned, I'm the editor, it exists, okay? So please don't tell me it exists, because it does, okay? As stating the obvious, okay? All right, so I don't need an opinion on that. If you feel contrary, if you dispute that climate change exists, then I'm sorry. There's, you need to go see somebody, okay? Because it exists, okay? So to me, there's no both sides there, okay? So please don't talk about climate change. Maybe like, oh, maybe as a passing remark, like this climate change is really like making things weird around here or something like that. Yeah, okay, maybe you gotta talk about how it's impacting that, but not. Please don't get people turn some people into scientists. Okay, and have them say like, "Well, this is all about climate change, and I believe it," and blah blah blah, and look at the patterns of weather. No, 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 please, no, no, no. Okay. All right, so that's due in 2 weeks. You have plenty of time to do that. I'll talk about it more next week. Okay. All right, so let's go to. Yes, I'm gonna become a citizen of Ireland. How about that? Dual citizen. Because I have relatives close to me that are Irish, born in Ireland. I just discovered recently. Anyway, so chapters 8 and 12. So you have essentially like alternative leads. Okay. Two reporters from competing news organizations attend a city council meeting. Get me out of the way. Where the mayor announces the city faces a deficit. He tells council members that tax increases will be needed. Both journalists carefully take copious notes, intent on capturing the sometimes contentious tone as city officials debate this fiscal dilemma. When the meeting ends, reporters write their stories, but one piece will be more widely read than the other. City officials Wednesday night debated the possibility of a tax increase. The other starts this way. So basically, city officials are going to need a pretty big rabbit foot. Basically, they're trying to show maybe there's like a little bit of creativity I can go into these stories, especially in the way they're worded. And what they're saying is that kind of catchy wording can actually kind of hook people in. That's a big word that's used in essentially this kind of journalism is hook. Okay. You want to hook people in, okay? Um, you know, see here. So if you go down here, let me just, so you have basically like your typical summary of local government officials see the continued use of virtual meetings, which skyrocketed during COVID as a way of increasing civil disagreement. And now you got, but instead what you're doing is you're telling a little narrative ahead of time at the top of the story. When Washington D.C. disenfranchised people serving time for sentences, Joel Castro, then at the detention facility, realized that he could not vote, not only vote, he could run serve for commissioner. So basically it's about like essentially like somebody like being able to participate in meetings now because of essentially like COVID-19, but it's like a backdoor way of doing it. Okay, basically starting with this person's interest in basically being more involved, largely because they were inspired by these online meetings. Okay. All right. Just kind of flipping through here. Yes, there are criticisms, that sort of thing. Yes, it's true that maybe like sometimes you do have to be a little careful. Okay. And because sometimes people get like again into like the adjectives and like put judgments on things that they say. I want to hear about a blue sky, not a glorious sky, is what I'm saying. Okay. If there's like a bleak sky, some people won't even dispute that. Okay. But maybe it's because when it's dark, maybe people like it like that. It's actually a great time to go out with photography is when the sky looks gray. There's no sunlight that kind of overexposes the shot or anything like that. Okay. Bury or delay lead is the most common title alternatively. Typically, it begins with interesting example or anecdote that sets the story's theme. Then a nut graph, perhaps a third or fourth graph, states the central point and provides a transition to the body, moving the story to the general issue or problem. Like a traditional lead, it summarizes the topic. It may also explain why a topic is important. Okay. So, and we've talked about that. So it's a multi-paragraph lead. No, we don't do quotation leads in this store in our work here. Okay, that's one thing I might have mentioned it before, but that is definitely not gold. Quotes are actually typically vague, and I haven't seen one in years, probably because I've just come down on it so hard. But putting a quote at the top of the story, it makes it very vague, very unwieldy, and there's no focus usually, and it's I think very jarring to the reader unless they say something incredibly outrageous or something. So. And that's the story, what the story is about. This is the feature story chapter, which is chapter 12. People love stories and stories everywhere in movies, books, magazines, newspaper, radio, TV, online. They can evoke emotions, a craving for adventure. After learning about a found shipwreck, inspiration after reading about a children's fight with cancer, encouragement when discovering how a family opened a restaurant while many others closed during the pandemic. Kind of like the TV show The Bear. Feature stories are nonfiction. They are fact-based storytelling. They are human interest stories, another term that's used, because they say something about life. Features are soft news because they exclude the news element of immediacy. So, I mean, there is a news element, and I would dispute that. But at the same time, there's not the sense of immediacy. Okay. Again, these are typically stories that are done like maybe they're done the same day as the big accident or something like that, but there can be done like a days after or something like that. There's still feature stories being written about 9/11, for instance, and the impact people have of that, people with cancer and that sort of thing. Okay. Um, so it's finding story ideas. I mean, you know, that's like the typical way of doing it that we've been doing. But actually, one good way to find feature stories is actually just really like doing like follow-ups and sidebars to major news events and things like that, and showing a softer side to the news. And sometimes you get things like, you get interviews where you can do that, where you can actually like essentially like oh, a nice kitty, or basically you have somebody like in fact, the first story that we did, the profile story, probably would have been done in a narrative kind of feature story format because that was, but I wanted something as simple as possible, so that's why we went with a straight lead. Um, but that kind of story is a more of a softer news story, a profile story, something. A profile story is something that usually breaks off of a bigger story. Not all the time, but maybe there's like some major thing that's happening. Maybe there's like not only that, maybe there's like a basketball team in town that's like doing really well, high school team. So what you do is you kind of break off the typical game score stories that just report the news, and you focus on one individual person and you write a feature story on them, and maybe there's something special or interest about them. Maybe they have like a particular handicap that affects their throwing or should I say their shooting in basketball. that sort of thing, okay? All right. So yeah, so so maybe we use more of like a suspenseful anecdotal lead for that type of story than we would have done before. Okay. We talked a bit about again, like the leads of feature stories, how they're anecdotal, okay, in nature. Okay. Sometimes like they even could be a little more dramatic. Like the sentences could be like maybe just a few words long and stop short, and maybe people just stop short in their reading. A lot of them are like profiles and personality features and that sort of thing. Um, okay. I mean, some of the things you might be looking at. The grid list, generate straight A's, fill in the blanks, and identify three different people. There's actually an exercise. I'm sorry. I think actually that's the end of the chapter. Yep. Now we got it ready for broadcasting. All right. So yeah, so that is actually what the feature story is, and that is due April 8th. Okay. I also provide an example of a magazine. Magazines actually, like, I know there's not so many of them around, but okay, so I don't want you to follow this format exactly, but when you really gonna get down to it, it's actually, I shouldn't say this format, this style, because the paragraphs in magazines are typically like really long, okay? And but they're more descriptive and that sort of thing. But when you really look down at like it's the minutia of a magazine story, it actually still follows that same kind of news format that I just described. Okay. Where you essentially have like an anecdotal lead. And maybe the lead might be like a really long paragraph or two, but at the same time, it comes to some sort of nut graph where it just sums everything up. And this was actually a personality story where the writer, Gate Talese, a very celebrated writer, um, did not actually interview Frank Sinatra, who at the time didn't give out a lot of interviews. They said he just observed him. And the story was essentially about Frank Sinatra, but it took like like an angle of Frank Sinatra that we didn't really know about. The famous singer, by the way, if you didn't know who he is, he was one of the most famous singers in American history. Died in 1998, born 1915. Crooner, sang "My Way," "New York, New York," et cetera, et cetera. So, um, anyway, so it was basically about he's actually kind of a gloomy Gus, a gloomy guy, and there was a lot of things going on that's wrong with him and that sort of thing. And there was one thing in particular that actually was wrong with him. The story was about, and that's what it says: Frank Sinatra has a cold, which may seem like rather benign and not so interesting as title, but the way it's framed in here, it makes it vital. Frank Sinatra holding a glass of bourbon in one hand and a cigarette in the other. By the way, this is written in 1965, so excuse some of the dialogue here, but stood in the dark corner of the bar between two attractive but fading blondes, who, yes, I know, who sat waiting for him to say something, but he said nothing. He had been silent during much of the evening, except now in his private club in Beverly Hills, he seemed to be more distant, staring out at the smoke and the semi-darkness. Room. See, there's like factual darkness or factual adjectives in here, okay? Not stark. It's darkness. It's just semi-darkness, okay? The two blondes knew as Sinatra's four male friends stood by that it was a bad idea to force a conversation on him because he had a mood of sullen silence. He'd been working on a film he didn't like. There was publicity about she's still around, she's on Twitter, Mia Farrow. Um, she was the one who accused Woody Allen of which I believe, by the way, of being essentially a pedophile. He was angry at the CBS television documentary of his life. He showed in 2 weeks reportedly prying his privacy, even speculating on his possible friendship with mafia leaders. It's a gang. Um, uh, Mobsters. He was worried about his starting role in NBC show. Sinatra was ill. That was the biggest problem, though. Okay. He was weak and it was sore and uncertain. He was a victim of ailments so common that most people would consider trivial, but when it cuts to Sinatra, they can plunge him into a state of anguish and even depression, panic, even rage. Frank Sinatra's a cold. So basically, it almost like it's the nut graph like kind of starts here, and then it continues into here, basically explaining why this is so bad. Sinatra with cold is a Picasso without paint, Ferrari without fuel, only worse. For the common cold robs Sinatra of that uninsurable jewel, his voice, cutting into the core of his confidence, and it affects not only his psyche but also seems to cause some sort of systemic nasal drip. So then the story follows some sort of pattern, talks about the impact on him and the impact on others and who, the what, the where, the why. But it's all centered around this nut graph area here. It's not really a nut paragraph, but it's like right here, this sentence right here. Okay. that basically identifies the theme of the story. Okay. All right. So that's pretty much it on the feature stories. I want to do one more thing. I want to show you actually a video on the real life Marv Bronson. And yes, just to show you that actually these things do happen in real life, and it was for real. There's some differences here. This guy's name is Dennis Kozlowski. He was the head of his company. It was a big time security company called Tyco. But he spent money like crazy. And what it shows here is it shows that this is why details are so important in stories. What it showed was that the details of the story, why they were so important, why they like pushed the actual resignation of Marv Bronson into like another orbit, another higher order. Okay. And this story essentially was a follow-up story to the Kozlowski getting jailed. In this particular case, the Marv Bronson of the story was actually jailed. So there were some differences, but anyway, but he had many of the same things, the expenses, the party, this sort of thing that Bronson had. Okay. And that's why we care about them, because we care about where our money is being spent ultimately by these people who own our own companies and develop our products. So that's what this story is. So let's watch this. Start from the start.
A year ago or so, the air was thick with tales of corporate scandal, lost pension funds, big-time theft, and even bigger-time prison sentences for the Enron gang. Then there was Dennis Kozlowski, CEO of Tyco, who was found guilty of, in effect, using Tyco's immense financial resources for what the prosecution described as his own personal piggy bank. You might remember the $6,000 shower curtain and stealing over $100 million from the company. But we wondered how the man who could whistle up a corporate jet on a whim or throw a $2 million birthday party was doing in his reduced circumstances. What's it like to go from king of the world to prisoner number 05A4820, serving 8 to 25 years behind bars? Once again, Dennis Kozlowski. We caught up with Dennis Kozlowski at Mid-State Correctional Facility in upstate New York. How you doing? Okay. Guests include murderers, drug dealers, and pedophiles, and beyond, multi-millionaire.
In my wildest imagination, when I would project myself into my late 50s and early 60s, where I would be or what I would be doing, if I make a list of 100 different places or 100 different things, here would never make that list.
He now earns $1 a day, mopping floors and slinging hash to his fellow inmates. In January, Kozlowski spent a week in hospital with a heart ailment and got to thinking. You've not talked publicly up till now. Why did you decide to do it?
When I was in the hospital in January, I was outside the emergency room feeling really uncomfortable, frightened. And that's when I really made the firm decision that I wanted to go through and talk to you at the time.
You became aware of your own mortality.
Very much so.
And you didn't want to leave this world
without at least an opportunity to talk about my side of the story to the extent that I can talk about it.
He agreed to speak with one stipulation, that we would not include anyone else in this story. Because of an appeal, he'll not discuss the details of his case, but he will say,
I believe in the judicial system. I think all that works. But in this case, the jury got it wrong.
That jury convicted him of 22 counts of grand larceny, conspiracy, and securities fraud. His trials occurred in the wake of a white-collar crime wave, Enron, WorldCom, and Martha Stewart. The news hound smelled blood, accused of looting his company of hundreds of millions of dollars and living the life of a patcher at stockholders' expense. He was the living, breathing version of Wall Street's Gordon Gekko. Green. Up to a point. What's puzzling is, why does a man who struggled so hard, so effectively to make it, become so careless or stupid or arrogant? Born in a tenement on the wrong side of the tracks in Newark, New Jersey, Kozlowski worked his way through school.
I played guitar in a band. I worked in a pharmacy. I worked in a car wash. I had 2 or 3 jobs going at any given time.
Where you came from, there weren't that many options.
No. Growing up in Newark, New Jersey at the time, you never thought of yourself growing up to become a CEO.
You started at Tyco, then a small New Hampshire manufacturing company, as an accountant making $28,000 a year. and worked his way up to CEO. He became known as Deal-a-Day Dennis, constantly acquiring new companies and building Tyco from a $40 million company into a $40 billion conglomerate.
Would like to become, all things equal, $100 billion company.
Wall Street could not get enough of the young, aggressive CEO. He also began making staggering amounts of money, among the top earning CEOs in the country.
We had a pay-for-performance culture at Tyco, so most of the money I earned was in the appreciation of Tyco stock.
One year you made, I think, $170 million.
Not sure 170, but I made over 100 million. Yeah.
Well,
More money than
$10 million here, $10 million there, who cares? What's it like to earn that kind of money?
It's a way of keeping score, I guess.
Keeping score meant keeping up with the masters of the universe. $30 million to build a mansion in Boca Raton, acquiring homes in Nantucket and Colorado, and just loose change $16 million for Endeavor, a vintage yacht. Wealth meant one thing, social acceptance another. He and his second wife, Karen Mayo, spent millions on painting. He joined the board of the Whitney Museum. For a pied-à-terre in New York, he had Tyco buy a $19 million apartment and decorated it with $11 million worth of stuff. The poor kid from Newark was stepping out on Fifth Avenue. With Dennis Kozlowski a few years ago, even contemplated going to Europe to buy old master paintings.
No, absolutely not. You know, the same with earning the amount of money I was earning at the time.
Was it your idea, or were you invited to join the board of the Whitney?
Oh, I was not my idea at all. I was invited to join the board, and I never made a board meeting.
So you were invited because they like having really rich guys on the board.
I assume it wasn't for my knowledge of art.
But it was art that would lead to his undoing. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office was investigating galleries that were helping customers avoid sales taxes. Kozlowski had purchased $13 billion worth of paintings, including a Renoir and Monet, with a Tyco apartment. But prosecutors said he had some of them shipped to Tyco's offices in New Hampshire, a state without sales tax. They were then trucked back to New York. In 2002, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office indicted Kozlowski for evading over $1 million in sales tax, and he resigned as CEO. But that was only the beginning. The Tyco board investigated its CEO's behavior and made public a report that was devastating. Kozlowski's excesses were revealed in excruciating detail. Decorations for the New York apartment became classic tabloid headlines, mocking the CEO's taste and his greed. The $15,000 doggy umbrella stand, and the ultimate symbol of his downfall, that $6,000 shower curtain. The coverage was really punishing.
That was horrible.
As overblown as the coverage may have been, you signed off on this.
I signed off on a decorator to decorate the Tyco apartment, and beyond that, that was my involvement. The first time I heard about that shower curtain, the first time was after I was out of the company, and I read about it in a newspaper, and I was calling around asking, "Where's the shower curtain?" But to this day, I wouldn't know it if it fell on me. So.
Then there was the 40th birthday party for Kozlowski's wife Karen in Sardinia. It was togas galore. 4-day festival of flesh.
That's right.
Jimmy Buffett was flown in for the music, and guests were treated to a special cake, an anatomically correct woman with exploding breasts. The cost was over $2 million. Since Kozlowski claimed it was in part a work retreat, Tyco further half the bill. Was it embarrassing for you, though, when they played that tape?
Oh, it was
kind of orgy going on.
Yeah, horrible. It was over the top. I was
So there's the party.
back by it, but I smiled and worked my way through it. Wanted the night to end as fast as I could.
Donald Trump called your behavior tacky.
Tacky. Tacky from Donald Trump?
From Donald Trump.
Oh, well, he would know.
Those excesses may have been tacky, but tacky doesn't say
well, anyway, that was before Trump was president, it was like 2008. That was during the financial crisis. But you know, whatever you would say about Donald Trump, that is classic Donald Trump. But anyway, all right, everybody. So that's it. So remember what we got due. We got the data journalism assignment. It's due on Monday. We have the rewrite. It's due a week from Monday, and then 2 weeks from Monday we have the feature news assignment, which will be our other than the major assignment proposal. I'm sorry, the major assignment will be our last assignment of the year. And I will be posting I'll also be posting the major assignment as well. So, which is due at the end of April. Right? So, anyway, so that's really it. Thanks a lot, guys, and I will be talking to you.